Hello and welcome to this foundational document overview video. In this one, we're going to be covering Federalist 70. So remember, just like all the other Federalist papers, this was a paper, in this case written by Alexander Hamilton, that was meant to argue in favor of the new Constitution. And one of the biggest hurdles for people in the 1780s accepting the new Constitution was the creation of executive power. The Articles of Confederation didn't really have a true, stable, permanent executive branch. And so the creation of the president and an executive branch in the Constitution caused many of these same people who had just fought against a tyrannical king in England, a decade before, that made them think twice about this Constitution. And so Hamilton really had his work cut out for him here, but he makes the case for executive power by talking about the energy that can make the executive branch work and how the whole country will be better for it. Alexander Hamilton, like many of the other Federalist papers, he walks through sort of the hypothetical, what will everyone agree upon? And in this case, he says, well, executive power has a purpose, right? The legislative branch has a purpose, which is to make the laws. And the executive branch, since classical times, had been conceived as a way of protecting from a myriad of threats. And that includes foreign threats, right? A military can't really act unless there is one voice that is leading it. Anarchy, right? What happens when the laws are not pleasing to the people, right? How are those laws enforced? Well, the executive protects us from anarchy. Factions, right? What happens when the worst case scenario of that Federalist 10 and Brutus 1 debate happens? What happens when a faction does take control of the majority of both houses of Congress? What do we then have mob rule? Well, the executive protects us from that. And the executive protects us from coups as well, right? This idea that a group may forcibly overthrow the government. Well, the executive has a role to play there and had, again, since the classical times of Greece and Rome. And so the executive has a lot of jobs. And this was understood even by the Confederation Congress because they could, in times of need, assign a state or a different person to serve in that executive role. But there wasn't, as I said, a permanent, stable executive. You might say there was a feeble executive. This is what Hamilton thinks in Federalist 70. And he says a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. Hamilton's argument is, look at the words, right? Executive branch, they're meant to execute the government. They're like to carry it out. If we have these great governmental ideas, but we don't actually have the tools to carry them out, well, then it doesn't matter how good our ideas are. They're going to be feeble in their execution. And the opposite of feebleness or of fragility in Hamilton's mind is energy. And that is what he really makes the case for. You see, he sets up a contrast that is really, really important. Maybe one of the most important things to understand, even in American politics today, is the contrast between the legislature and the executive branch. See, remember when we talked about the legislature, perhaps in our chapter about Congress, the whole theme of that chapter is that the legislature is meant to go slowly. They should carefully consider each bill before making it a law. A law is really just, in some ways, a limitation on the people. And so we don't want to limit the people, we want to limit the government. And the way we do that is by having a legislature that slowly deliberates over each and every law. But once the law is passed, it's passed. It's been debated by our representatives. They've decided, yes, this is a good bill. We want to pass it into a law. And so the executive needs to carry out those carefully considered laws quickly. We've had our time to discuss them. We found that they are good. And so now energy is needed to carefully, to ensure that those carefully considered laws are actually taken out. And if the executive branch has energy, that is the ability to actually carry out these laws effectively, then two really good things are going to result from that. Or Hamilton suggests we would be led to consider two more things by understanding this idea of energy. The first is that energy is going to lead us to realize that unity in the executive branch is a good thing. Some people agreed with everything up to this point. They said, yes, an executive branch is important to carry out the laws, but maybe there should be a presidential council, 3 people instead of 1, for instance. But no, Alexander Hamilton says a single president is more energetic than a council. And he says, think about 3 important elements of the president's job. Decision, decisiveness. Can we act more quickly if there's 1 person or 3 people, right? And obviously, it takes a lot longer to make a decision if you have 3 or 5 people instead of 1. So decision will be better if we have a singular president. Activity, the ability to actually act on something. Once a decision has been made, let's say particularly a decision about war, well, what do we do? Well, we can act on that much more quickly if there is not division of opinion, right? That action will be unilateral, it will be clear, it will be consistent. And lastly, secrecy. This might sound bad, but what is Hamilton getting at? There's going to be knowledge that comes into the hands of the government that is important to keep secret in order to keep Americans safe. You can think in recent years when presidents have discovered the location of important, anti-American terrorists, for instance, it's important that our enemies don't know that we know where they are. And so there's a certain degree of secrecy even from Congress. And again, a secret is best kept by one person. And so a single president is absolutely critical for decision, activity, and secrecy. Hamilton calls this unity in the executive branch. There's one person at the top. Secondly, if we have unity in the executive branch, Hamilton says energy and unity together are going to lead to safety in the executive branch. You see, some people said, well, if you have a single president, how is that any better than a singular king? Well, because there are 2 major tools that make sure our president is safer than a king. Think about to the classical conception of kings, whether that was in England or all the way back to the pharaohs of Egypt. The kings were representatives of God, and so there was no accountability. Anytime a king was speaking, if you didn't like it, well, that was really God. But so you can't really debate that. The same thing does not apply to our president today, as you know. And so the fact that we have one president means when they mess up, it's clear who messed up, right? We can hold them accountable. We know, okay, the president messed up. Imagine if there were 3 presidents instead, and a decision was made and it wasn't entirely clear who made that decision. How would we know who to hold accountable? Or imagine if Congress makes a mistake. Well, we know that the president has to sign off on laws too, so we can still hold the president accountable for that. Congress, there's 500 of them. How do we know who to hold accountable? The president is the person that we can hold accountable, and so it's a much safer position than either that council of 3 or than a singular king. And the biggest difference here is removability. You couldn't remove a king, right? A king, the only way you removed him was really by killing him, and that got you the death penalty as well. And so what do we mean by removability? Well, it's rather simple. Every 4 years, our president's term is up. And if we don't like the job that person has done, then the states, through the Electoral College, can exercise their right to vote a new president in. And so the fact of the matter is, yes, a single president might at first glance sound like a singular king, but it's actually the exact opposite. It's the single person so we know who to hold accountable, and so we know that we can remove that person every 4 years. So that summarizes Federalist 70, the idea that the executive branch was not something to worry about. It was actually, with proper energy, going to ensure that this new government's ideas were feasible and actually carried out, particularly with respect to making sure that our government was accountable and that we could remove those leaders when they weren't doing a good job. Thanks for tuning in. I wish you the best of luck. Have a great day.